Today we have with us for Books at Berklee, Professor Kevin Block-Schwenk, an associate professor of liberal arts at Berklee, where he teaches economics and mathematics. We're turning the tables on Kevin today because normally he's the interviewer for his series on Berklee alumni and their successful careers, which can be heard at otherberkeleyalumni.com, and where he's conducted more than 200 interviews. Among other activities, Kevin assists in Earthapalooza, the Earth Day activities at Berklee. He runs also a small real estate business and enjoys biking, games, history, vegan cuisine, and a lot more. And I see your bike in the background there. And welcome to Books at Berklee. Kevin, today we're going to discuss the Bill Gates book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Ooh. And the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. Well, it seems like we need a lot of breakthroughs. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to highlight this book, especially with Earth Day coming up on April 22nd.
Sure. We often hear that climate change is a really big problem, but not the details on what are going to be the solutions are often a little vague. And we talk about different metrics of successes. Oh, this would power 5,000 homes. Well, what does that mean? Oh, this is equivalent to taking 3 cars off the road. But again, what does that mean? Bill Gates looks at things, you know, the Bill Gates Foundation has been mostly focused on public health from a global perspective. And this also looks at pollutants from a global perspective, and globally, what do we, the human species, have to do, and what steps are actually meaningful and measurable, and what's going to look good but not get us to where we have to be.
Yeah, so Bill Gates takes sort of a macro view and the big picture view of dealing with it and looking at solutions, not just the problems. He's not listing a bunch of problems that many people already know. He's talking about what can we do about it.
And really, you know, we need to roll up our sleeves and kind of has a real plan as to how we get out of this, as opposed to, you know, just shake his fist in the air and go back to regular life.
Well, you know, I feel like a lot, maybe this is just my perception, but I feel like a lot of students feel very stressed. I mean, and it has some news have been talking about this lately, that young people feel very stressed with talking about climate and, you know, all the things that are possibly going to happen or will happen. What positive or comforting message can we take from this book?
I mean, first of all, like, yeah, people should feel really stressed. We've only gotten a tiny taste as to how bad it's going to get, even if we do everything right. But a couple things we could take from the book. One is that the idea of this book is we need to get down to zero emissions, or technically net zero, meaning you still emit a little, but you absorb a little in other places, by 2050.
That's like 30 some years away.
It's 28 years away. And to put it another way, 28 years ago, I was still out of college. I'd voted in a couple elections. I was married to my wife. So, like, you know, time passes quickly.
Yeah, it really does.
And that, you know, this doesn't mean we just keep doing like we're doing until 2049 and then make a snap decision, right? It's kind of like, you know, when we constructed 160 Mass Ave, it wasn't like saying, oh, the building will be up in 2 years. Well, that means we do nothing until the last week. That means it's a 2-year process. And he was seeing this as a 25 to 30-year process to get us to zero. But the point is, it is doable. At least large parts of it are doable with the technologies we have today. And then he points out, where do we have to innovate to get the rest of the way there? Another message which I think people have to realize is that climate change, this isn't from the book also, but it's not a pass fail, right? Like 1.5 degrees warming, we're already at 1, it's kind of bad. 1.5 is worse than 1, 2 is worse than 1.5, 2.5 is worse than 2, 3.5 is worse than, 3 is worse than 2.5, and so on. If we fail to even, I think he's really aiming at a 2-degree warming here. If we fail and we end up at 2.2 or 2.3, that is still infinitely better than 3.5 or 4. And
Yeah.
3.5 or 4 is still a whole lot better than 5. And that, you can say, even if collectively we fail, and I really, really hope we don't, but, there's the barely fail. Students should be familiar with this concept, right? You got a 58, it's not passing, but you're close, just give it a little more, little more effort and you're there, versus like, wow, this is utterly hopeless, and similarly, a success can be a barely a success or a huge success. So every bit of effort you do matters. Every 1/10 of a degree is worth fighting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's talking about going from 51 billion tons of carbon being emitted every year to like countering 51 billion tons of carbon to zero in some
Right,
way.
reducing most of it and countering probably 10% of it.
Right. So that's huge, huge kinds of numbers. And also thinking about the fact that that has been happening for so many years, every year, more and more and more. One of the things that Gates points out is that fossil fuel pricing that we, talk about today. Now, of course, recently it's gone up a lot and people are complaining, all the inflation and all that. And of course, rightly, because they've been hit in their pocketbooks, but fossil fuels really don't reflect the true cost of the fossil fuels.
Oh, not at all.
They're really subsidized and they've been, adding to the environmental impact, and that environmental impact is costing people elsewhere. We just don't see it at the fuel pump, but we see it elsewhere.
Right, in economics, we call that externalities, where it has effects on people who are not part of the purchase or the transaction. That, for example, we know that as the planet warms, it supercharges storms. So were there storms before the planet warmed up? Of course there were, but they were fewer and they were on average weaker. And so now people who are being walloped by storms, the person being hit by a storm may not have done anything. They may have lived a very eco-friendly life and put out extremely little in the way of emissions, but they still get walloped by the storm, and that's absolutely a cost. Right now, as you and I are talking, there's a deadly heat wave in northern India, and
Right.
there's fear that they're going to be running out of water. And again, India has contributed a tiny, tiny fraction of the problem, the total climate pollution, especially relative to population, but they're getting walloped. It's not fair.
And at
But
the same time, we're having ice storms, right? Just
yeah,
just west of
yeah.
here.
I've heard the term sometimes used that it's not, we should say the word global weirding rather than global warming.
Yeah, I like to say climate change because it's
Yeah.
just changing in so many different ways and so suddenly in so many different ways. So one of the ways that been thinking about personally, and also I know a lot of folks in the area think about is the alternatives to fossil fuels, using wind and solar. Of course, in Massachusetts, there's a lot of discussion about wind power, and that has come about to some extent, and using less energy overall, and everybody trying to save as much as you can on your energy. But one of the things that Gates brings out, and that was so interesting in this book, I think, was that energy to produce steel or concrete and things like that, things that we make things with, like housing and buildings, that most of us don't have any direct say on that.
Right,
Those,
we call the energies being embedded in so many products that most energy we use is not us turning on lights or even driving from point A to point B.
yeah, what would be something that we could think about doing about those kind of energy sinks that are proposed in this book?
Um,
I
a-
mean, how do we
and
get to people using energy efficient concrete or something like that?
well, I mean, a great frame, which I feel is, Bill Gates uses in this book, which I had not read before this, is the concept of a green premium. That the idea is most of the time, when you don't factor in those externalized costs of the worst storms and the health problems and the civil wars caused in, say, in Syria by people having to flee their farms, and then they're restless and angry because there's been a drought. If you just say, what's the way we do money, right? What did it cost the company to make this? And what does it cost to make a green product? Nearly always the green product is going to cost more. If you say you're not allowed to use these chemicals, you're not allowed to use these processes, which clearly were developed there for a reason because they were quote cheapest, then it'll add to your cost. But you measure the green premium, and then his short version, he says, if the green premium is small or non-existent, deploy. If it's really large, innovate, meaning make it small. The idea, though, is that if the green premium, a business will rationally calculate what's the green premium versus are we going to impose a cost, right? So if we say every ton of carbon that a business emits, we're going to hit you for $100. And then the green premium is $60 for a ton, right? We have to pay an extra $60 to make this eco-friendly cement or something that doesn't emit carbon. That then, if you have $100 a ton carbon tax, it now makes financial sense for the business to go with the green version. So Bill Gates, he mentions it very in passing a few places at the book, but he's really pounding the need for us to put a tax, call it a fee or a fine or whatever you want, but effectively a tax on emissions so that not polluting becomes cheaper than polluting.
So that's
It's not up to the individual to
right.
say, oh, was this thing made out of green wood or green cement, or I mean, you could go insane doing all the research on everything, and 99% of people won't do it.
Right. And even when buildings have a LEED or they are architecturally considered very energy efficient and so on, we don't no idea about these other energy sinks that went into building that.
Yeah, that usually measures the energy that the building uses for heating and cooling, not the materials.
That's right.
I sometimes have these debates where people are like, oh, green roofs are the solution. And I'm like, if you have to make all of your steel beams twice as thick and pour a whole lot more concrete so that you can now support a few feet of dirt on your roof, you probably just put out way, way, way more emissions than these plants are going to absorb in the next 1,000 years.
Yeah. It's sort of like finding that balance between, what you can do to mitigate and what you can do to change what you're doing and so on.
Right. I mean, individual habits are good, but you'd say the biggest thing is we need a different system. But by different system, I mean we need to put a price on polluting and do some other government actions like really promote and support innovation and build the infrastructure that we need. That we'll get to later, but the single most important thing anyone can do for the environment is vote.
Well, so he proposes, in terms of these innovations of carbon capture technologies to help reduce emissions, but he doesn't include using land to resink carbon through different farming methods or reforestation. And quite a number of other books that I've read talk a lot about kind of different farming methods that will absorb carbon into the land itself. And do you have any thoughts about these different kinds of strategies that, I don't know that from an economic standpoint, what that would cost farmers, but I know that there are different technologies on that.
Land can be used, and once again, our economies are incredibly complex, right? Like how many different products do we make in this country? 90,000, 2 million, kind of depends how you slice and dice it. And we get the occasional shortage, but overall we're pretty darn good at supplying the right amount of stuff to everyone. Not everyone gets everything they need, but we do not have, dry erase markers coming out of our ears and being lit on fire because there's too many of them, while at the same time, nobody can ever find a rubber band, right? We manage, and the thing that really sorts all this out in a very elegant way is the price mechanism. If there's not enough of something being produced, the price starts going up, and then producers say, oh, I think I'll make more rubber bands. Or if there's too much being produced, now producers can't sell what they have, and they say, oh, I better cut the price. So in terms of carbon absorption, yes, if we have a carbon tax of $100 a ton, if a farmer adopts some new agricultural methods that absorb a ton of carbon dioxide, they should get that 100, or at least a very large part of that 100. For encouragement in those measures, you have to be very, very careful how everything is measured. It's easy, like he mentions hydroelectric dams, which seem like such a great deal in terms of carbon. I know I'm winding back to answering your question, that they seem like such a great deal in that water just pushes through this turbine and you get electricity. But he points out that they're actually worse than coal for the first 50 years, because you flood the land and then all the organic matter decays and turns into gases that go up into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and methane. So that, I know that there used to be a huge problem where Europe would give credit for burning vegetable oil, and then over in Indonesia, they'd cut down jungle to make these palm oil plantations. And the soil, which had been rainforest, now released so much gas that it would take like 700 years of farming palm trees to make up for it. Again, a good price mechanism, putting a price on carbon, is going to help a real lot. And, Bill Gates says we should support innovation, and agriculture is absolutely a part of that. And I think he does talk about that in the book, alternatives to chemical fertilizers as one example.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things though that I guess was sort of the elephant in the room, if you will, about the book and about climate change is that sort of the role the billionaire class plays, sort of their lax views on their own environmental impact and the high amount of carbon usage that they, as individuals even, and certainly as a class, use compared to, say, the average European or the average American. The amount of excessive carbon per person that they're contributing. One physicist, Kevin Anderson, wrote that 50% of all carbon CO2 is emitted by 10% of the population, mostly the richest. If that small group reduced their emissions to the level of the average European, the world would immediately cut emissions by 1/3.
All right, sorry.
So I guess my question is, how are we taking advice from someone in the billionaire class who maybe should be giving this advice to the billionaires who are emitting, if they quit emitting at the levels that they are, themselves, there would be a huge reduction in carbon.
That's a wonderful question with several parts, and I can go one at a time. One is to answer the last bit first. I actually did, having read this book, feel like, yes, a regular citizen gets something out of it, but the book probably was more directed toward business leaders and other people with real financial heft. You call it the elephant in the room, it is an issue, but at pages 14 and 15, he has a couple pages, early on in the book where he talks about this exact issue and his own carbon footprint. And that, the wealthy, I'll just read one little thing. He says, although heavy emitters like me should use less energy, the world overall should be using more of the goods and services that energy provides. And you talk about the 10%. Is it okay? Can I share a little graph? Can you make me
Sure,
co-host here?
absolutely.
So this is a graph from Thomas Piketty, Capital and Ideology, all about emissions. And he's looking at what share of emissions are coming from the top polluting 1%, 10%. One thing that's worth noting is that, for example, North America and China are putting out comparable emissions, but we have many, North America has a much larger share of the high polluters, and China has a much lower share. And a lot of this, of course, a lot of Chinese emissions is simply them making stuff that we use. So, should those emissions be attributed to them or us? But here's the point. You talk about the top 10% of the population. Well, in North America, we're, about half of those top 10%. A little math later, roughly half of Americans are in the top 10% of global polluters. So it's not, just the 1 in 10 in America. It's half of Americans are in this group. Now, let's even say, let's acknowledge Washington State, one of the greenest states, had a referendum on a carbon tax and spending on the environment. I think it was 6 years ago. It failed. It got voted down, convincing half of Americans to reduce their emissions by 75%, while asking the rest of the world to do nothing. I don't see the politics in that succeeding. And I'd add that the goal here, even if we do succeed, and as they say, if we cut emissions by a third, great. We somehow had this, green socialist revolution in this country, reduced our emissions by a third. We still have 2/3 left to do. Right. And now it's not, we just got those selfish over-consumers to pay her back because, who again are half of the people in this country. Now, every bit you cut is going to really hurt. You can't get to zero or even remotely near to zero without fundamentally changing the technologies or yanking things back so hard that it'll make, being an occupied country during World War II look like a party.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of that, the people who are going to be displaced by environmental degradation, mostly, let's say, just as one example, coastal cities as sea levels rise. And where do most people on Earth live? Most people on Earth live in coastal cities. So if you have migration away from coastal cities with displacement, that's the majority of the Earth's population is going to be on the move.
I agree. For what it's worth, I feel like the coastal cities flooding out problem is more a problem for the 2100s.
Maybe.
That climate refugees now are going to mostly be people whose land overheats and dries out.
Right. The first 50 years will be lack of water and
then land. Then we get the melting ice caps, and
right.
it goes because coastal cities can handle a couple feet in sea level rise. It's when it's if we lose, the Greenland ice sheet and it goes up 14 feet, or we lose Antarctica and it goes up another 60 feet.
Knows. But anyway, we don't know all, exactly how this is going to play out. One of the things that Gates offers are these technology solutions he's suggesting, many of which haven't been invented yet. I mean, we can try to innovate and get the technology, but it doesn't actually exist here. So what is the value in, trying to go down a road based on, an iffy technology solution when so much is at stake? And you just pointed out that you know, having 75% or half of Americans reduced by 75% would just not be realistic politically. So
Right.
how
I mean, again,
technology make up for in that?
let's make it clear that and this is in the book, this is just me, right? It's not technology or politics. It's technology and politics, right? We need government to put a price on pollution, and we need government to fund innovations in infrastructure. For example, you mentioned earlier solar and wind. If we have lots of wind in Vermont and not much wind, but lots of people in Boston, we need transmission lines that can bring the wind power from Vermont to Boston.
Right.
And um, now I'll say this, I'm going to show my age here. I'm sharing, I'm 52 years old. I did my first got active on the environment in 1990. That was 32 years ago.
Mhm.
I have voted in every Democratic primary for the person whom I consider the most environmentally progressive candidate. Guess what? I've been pushing for 32 years. We've been losing badly.
Yeah.
And now we have 28 years till the 2050 clock. And 28 years, by the way, means we really get started within a few. And this notion that like,
I mean, lots of severe weather is already happening.
right, where again, winning means I mentioned it's still going to be worse than today. The temperature's still going up. But the question is, will it be kind of an ouch, or will it be something really catastrophic? And the point is that like, yeah, is technology great? No, like there was a brief window in the early 70s in which lots of great laws were being passed. And if the country had stayed on that path, maybe the politics alone would have driven it and technology would have played a much more, auxiliary role. We fought that fight and fought it again and again and again and again and again. We have been losing. If we spend as much, I have seen virtually no progress in 32 years active on this issue. And we have 28 left and really 5 left to get our butts in gear. So if we, say politics alone, politics is a necessary component playing with technology. But if we think that there's going to be a great awakening and we're suddenly going to do in 5 years after nothing for 30 something years.
Well, Americans tend to respond to crises. And maybe that's one of the reasons so many more people are concerned about the environment, although the most recent poll said it's not the top concern of voters right now.
It's not. And, look at our collective faceplant in the pandemic. And that was a whole lot. And that's one where if you don't protect yourself against COVID, you're likely going to get sick in a couple months, not a few decades, things get worse.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was a little concerning to me about the book, and I think that there were so many positive aspects of people reading it and understanding the points that he's making in it. But it was a little bit dismissive, I felt, of climate activists. And as you say, we've been losing some of these political battles, but yet there's a lot of climate activity that has been going on that I feel has, has mitigated some of the worst that might have happened had they not been active for the last 50 years. So I'm just wondering.
I will say, to give politics its due, the Montreal Protocol of 1987, which we phased out chlorofluorocarbons, was one of the great leaps forward of the 20th century.
And successful, an international effort that everybody went with. And they just banned it and everybody did it and it worked.
That was absolutely unambiguous success. It was 35 years ago, but right. It was,
But they haven't been able to muster that kind of unique, it was a unique experience where there was so much consensus and concern, and people just, governments of the world just said, yep, we're on board, that's it.
that was something which was really deadly, and also it was a very small group of chemicals that there were substitutes for. Whereas, you know, burning stuff is so fundamental to how we do everything, or so many, how we make things, how we get around, and so on, that it's a much heavier lift.
What kinds of things would you suggest for students who are, concerned about the environment, other than reading this book, that you might have for them?
I mean, I mentioned voting,
Yeah.
but also he mentions eating less meat, which is a large factor. I'd say plan your life to reduce your commute, because although he has, getting around as roughly 1/6 of global emissions, it's more like a third in the United States. So, and it's our number one source is people driving. Although of that getting around, something like a third to 40% of that is goods being delivered by truck, et cetera. It's not individual cars. In any case, for students, yeah, try to minimize commute. Flying is awful for the environment if you can minimize that. But so many of these individual life choices are really just about, as Gandhi says, be the change you want to see. Use your voice to advocate for better things, both with government if you can, and also with people you know, but that living the life, walking the walk, at least some, it's going to give you a stronger voice. You'll, you know, I've never seen a movement of people who say, we're doing this bad thing and make us stop. It's always, the person who starts to say, maybe I should drive less. And okay, I want cars to get better mileage and to the cities to become more pedestrian friendly.
Yeah.
So,
And
and I would say as musicians, people, sorry to cut you off, as musicians, people have a huge voice.
I think musicians have a wonderful opportunity to be influencers of others in terms of this issue and getting other people on board, getting large movements of people on board. Music and the arts are a major way that people come to become aware of the issues. People get, involved in movements through music, and I think it's you know, in the hands of the artists, and to some extent, to get the political movement going and to be aids to that.
Absolutely. And once again, well, this is very tech driven. It's a tech driven where politics absolutely plays a role. We need to advocate for a higher, to put a price on pollution.
Okay.
That's sprinkled throughout the book.
Okay, was there anything else you wanted to bring out about this book to our audience and listeners today?
Well, I'd say that he does some interesting breakdowns in terms of where pollution comes from. And again, this is looking at it from a global perspective. But he has, I'll have to do this out loud, that making things is 31% or just under a third. Electricity is a little over a fourth at 27%. Although, as he says, the way we're going to solve a lot of this is to do with electricity what we've been doing with non-electric sources. So for example, heating can be electric heat because if you make your electricity cleanly, that then you don't have to burn anything. Growing things is 20%. One slight frustrating moment and critique I had was he says, although some ways of calculating it, the American diet is responsible for more pollution than every other thing combined. And it's like, well, which is it? Is it 20% or is it 50 something percent? Come on, don't just dangle that out there that actually meat might be a whole lot worse than I'm saying, and then just leave that. But in any case, he gives it 19%, maybe a lot more. Getting around 1/6, although again, that's based on a world which is much, much less car centric than the United States. And then heating, cooling, the last 7%. A little surprising that number's so low, but most people live places where things are much more moderate temperatures. So I thought and then I could, he
I'm
sort of had a chapter on each one. Here's where the emissions come from. Here are the technologies we have. Here are ones with small to no green premiums. Here's where we need to innovate.
No, there were several times where he said, well, I invested in that idea, that didn't work or something. And, there were a number of those in there. So he's been looking at this issue for a long time and trying to look at business solutions, business as part of the solution, I guess. Innovation as part of the solution. One of the things that has occurred to me in our discussion is the role of culture and how difficult it is for people to change really anything that they've been doing a certain way for a while. And if you take, for example, just something simple like having large grass lawns that use fertilizer and a lot of water and, all of this kind of thing. And
Right.
that, grass, which wants to be dormant in the summer and they keep watering it so it'll turn green. Those kinds of things are a cultural issue that takes tremendous amount of effort to change a basic cultural thing in the suburbs or in the, people's homes and things like that.
I agree. That was actually an answer I didn't give to an earlier question of, the billionaire class is like, is it gross that, people will build these mega yachts that burn ungodly amounts of fuel? Absolutely. But, if the moment somebody's pay goes from 50,000 to 80,000, they run out and buy a huge gas guzzling sport utility vehicle or truck, well, are we really any different, or are we just doing the exact same thing on a smaller scale? And if you have a society where people would react to an increase in income by just getting a larger house, a larger vehicle, then even if you did eliminate the billionaire class and redistributed the money, I don't think emissions would really change.
One of the things that has struck me in reading this book also is that the idea that as you rightly pointed out, there are 28 years left and we really have to get going within the next few years and getting people motivated to do those kind of dramatic changes in a very short amount of time. At this point, it's a very short amount of time. But more is convincing people. I mean, you can't convince people, as you said, of a deadly virus, might endanger their health. How do we convince them of something that could happen 20 years from now? Or people who buy property on the ocean, because, well, let's enjoy the beach now while it's there. I mean, just
I do think there's going to
living their life right now for the moment.
Well, I would say this, which is I do think that's one area where I do anticipate a very large awakening. Because let's talk about beach property for a moment. Let's imagine we're at the point where like, oh crap, too late, sea levels are rising, right? At a decent clip where this isn't going to stop. So let's imagine there's a place that, that you're planning on holding a place for 10 years and that in 10 years it'll be underwater. Would you want to pay good money for that place? And your answer is, of course not, right? I wouldn't want to buy a place knowing that when I'm ready to sell it, it's going to be worth nothing. But then it's like, okay, but now let's pull back before 10 more years. If it's 20 years before it goes underwater, but you say, I want to have this place for 10 years, but when I go to sell it, the person buying it is going to say, well, it's going to be underwater in 10 years, so they're not going to be willing to pay me much money. So I don't want to pay much money for that. And then, okay, go back 30 years. So now you say, by similar logic, the person who says, wow, it's going underwater in 20 years isn't going to be willing to pay much money for it. So I don't think I will. This is, for example, why stock prices bounce around so much, because they're not about the money a company makes today. They're all about the money a company will make in 2023, 24, 25, 26, 27, 2059, 2174, et cetera, that once there's a little bit of acknowledgement that these places are going underwater, will be worthless at some point, we could see a very, very fast plummet in the prices where cities will fail economically, coastal cities, long before the water actually goes over them.
And that's because of the economics.
Because of the economics, then no one's going to want to buy a place that's doomed in the long run. Even if you're not there, you don't think you'll have a seller. So I'm sorry, I'm slightly off of the initial question, but I am saying that I do feel, right, you were talking about people wanting to live for today. That's something I think we may be seeing long before the cities themselves go underwater, is a rapid plummet in value of coastal properties.
Interesting. That isn't something that I have heard before, and I'm sure that many people would want to think about that if they're redeveloping land. I know that when the Katrina hit, some of the land was left to be empty and returned to be areas that could be absorb flooding in some coastal areas, and some coastal areas never rebuilt all the homes. People abandoned those areas, and I imagine that there are many more areas that are sinking in the coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, where ultimately people will have to abandon those areas as they become inundated.
Right. Yeah, it is happening at a small scale, and it's small but accelerating. I mean, I feel terrible for, say, Bangladesh, where 75 or 80% of the country is within 2 meters of sea level.
Right. I mean, that's going to displace 110 million people or something.
Something like that. I mean, the amount of refugees we're seeing today and the social tensions that come out of those refugees, that's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, it's going to, climate refugees are going to make all the refugees we've seen the last few years look like not very much.
Yeah, which is again why every 1/10 of a degree matters.
Right.
Because, climate change is not just, oh, it's a little warmer today. It's, how much more land dried out? How many refugees are there? Do refugees inflame social tensions that then make countries not want to deal with problems? It's a feedback loop where it looks like a not too bad change can become a whole lot worse, but that means stopping something can lead to far more benefits than it appears.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the people who are going to be affected the most, the poor, the people who live in these poor coastal areas, are not necessarily the ones who are creating the climate problem or the big carbon emitters. And
no, not at all. It's, if anything, the correlation goes the other way.
Right. And so their future is in the hands of people, the small minority of people who are the largest emitters, and all of us who are doing our carbon emissions. And everybody can do a little bit. I think it will help. I mean, every little bit helps.
A little bit helps, but he does remind us that during 2020, when so much was shut down, emissions dropped 5%. That just, we're going to drive less and stay home and do a lot less. That's 5%. 95% of what we put out is just baked in, right? You're still staying home, but everything you had was delivered by fuel burning trucks.
Right.
And the materials were burning fuel to bake, which is again why I feel like the frame of aim for zero is better than, oh, let's all just do a little less. I mean, when I started in the 1990s, it was, we need a 50% cut within, a couple decades. And I spent literally like every decade of my adult life hearing people say, we have 10 years to get our act together, then it's going to be bad. And then it was like, well, another 10, now it's like, oh, it's kind of bad. We have 10 years to get our, um, but I feel like Bill Gates, we talk about hope. He's just like, we can do this. And I think he's set the right target, which is we want a situation where you can go, it's not you eat less food, it's we want, or even you have to pick these items on the menu, but you feel ashamed if you pick these other items. We want a situation where you can go to menu, eat the food you want to eat and not worry that you're overheating the planet. We want a situation where when you have money, you can spend it on something and not feel shame that you're hurting other people through your spending. And there's some pretty simple policies that'll accomplish that. And I feel like they're laid out very well in this book.
Yeah. I agree that we're going to need sort of an all of the above approach. We're going to need government. We're going to need political. We're going to need the individual actions of people. We're going to need massive movements. We're going to need huge amounts of change of culture and large amounts of innovation and all of the above actions in a very short time to come together and somehow come together. I mean, I think about the green movement in Europe and how long that's been going on, and the expansion of these movements or environmental movements to convince the unconvinced. I don't know that you can do that. So you just sort of have to move ahead with the folks that do care about it and are convinced.
You do. And I think one other thing which Bill Gates emphasized, again, he's really into technology and innovation, is, one area where spending helps is he says, if you spend money on environmentally friendly products that are particularly new to the market, even or maybe especially if they feel overpriced, that gives businesses the money they need to keep going and innovating and make the products better.
Yeah, so one example of that was that before you could really directly buy wind power in Massachusetts, you had the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, which joined people together to buy wind power and kind of get these people who were putting up the windmills a going concern so that they could keep going and growing and get things off the ground. So it's almost like having a premium in a way, electrical premium. But on the other hand, it eventually turns out over the years that then the wind power is something that more and more people can now participate in.
Absolutely.
And purchase. The same thing with electrical cars. You can get an electric car. It does have some of its own environmental issues with batteries and so on, but still the emissions are zero. And and they have a whole host of benefits to running electric cars.
Quick sidebar, everything I've read is that an electric car on average is about 1/3 as bad as a comparable gas burner.
Well, I have an electric car and I'm very pleased with it. And it's amazing how well it runs and how quiet it is. And that you don't have to ever go to a gas station.
That is nice.
It's very, very nice.
Right, like and the more people in electric cars, the less people are gonna freak out about gas prices because it'll just be like, don't care.
And right now, today, if you plan very carefully, you can take long trips. But when they do all of these infrastructure, building more electrical stations, then it'll be a lot easier. People are concerned about adding time to the trip, but the way it can work is that people can make short stops. And when you charge something, it charges very quickly at the very beginning, and then like your phone, can slow down for a longer period of time. But you can make short stops and be charged and just keep going. So it's not really that much more time to travel.
Cool.
than stopping and filling up for gas and making a stop, on a long trip. But it's getting more locations so people have more variety and can feel more certain about it.
Right. And that's again an example where we need government to give that heave ho of building or at least encouraging the infrastructure that will support people owning electric cars and it not being annoying.
Right. And I think that's what they're doing, that the government has included charging stations as part of the infrastructure bill. So those are all steps in the right direction. I think that this has been a very nice talk. I really appreciate it, Kevin.
Sure. Well,
And,
thank you for,
what are some of your activities planned for Earth Day?
well, Earthapalooza was last Friday. We tend not to conflict with the actual Earth Day. You were talking about students and as musicians, all the influence people can have. And I'm proud to say that at Earthapalooza, there were 6 different student bands performing their original music about songs for the environment.
That's fantastic.
And yeah, and paid for it too. And then people giving different speakers. We had somebody there from the Boston Cyclists Union who spoke about that's what area where we've seen a whole lot of local progress. So I wanted to bring someone to learn about their special sauce. What is it that they can make that political progress? And get the best short answer the speaker was able to give was a combination of inside power and outside power. You have mobilized citizens and advocacy, but you've also built relationships with people inside the room where the decisions are getting made.
Right. And we've seen that Boston has made some really major strides, like the bike lanes, and major thoroughfares like Mass Ave, where people can feel a little bit more secure in taking their bikes down to the city and riding to work and so on. And
Exactly.
those kinds of things are really all helping out.
Yeah, and I'd say in general, if anyone's watching this between now and Earth Day, if you Google Earth Day, you'll see lots of different things happening.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Books at Berklee, and it was an interesting book to read and to get through and see the different aspects of things that many of us have not really known about or thought about, or things that we can do or advocate for to improve the environment and have a positive way to act that can help things going forward to improve the world.
Yeah, I'd add that it's about 230 pages and the pages aren't all that big. So I think my group got through it in 6 weeks.
Very good. Yeah,
Well, thank you.
it's easy to read. I can say that it's pretty easy to read, easy to follow. So I don't think that would be a problem for people.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Are we good here?
I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.